Welcome back to the autonomic nervous system. Let's review the three key features of the neuron. The dendrites of this neuron receive information from the axons of other neurons which synapse onto the dendrite of the neuron. And remember, it is this interface here between the axon of the first neuron and the dendrite of the second neuron that we call the synapse. The second key feature is the cell body, or the soma, of the neuron, which contains the nucleus and the genetic material. The third key feature is the axon, which is a long extension off of the cell body, which is specialized for carrying electrical information in the form of the action potential. So in general, when we think about the function of a neuron, we think about the neuron receiving information at the dendrite, transmitting that information in electrical form to the cell body, and then the axon sending an action potential away from the cell body towards the synapse with the next neuron. Remember that the key principle of the autonomic nervous system is that it consists of chains of two neurons, shown here as number 1 and number 2. The first neuron forms a synapse onto the second neuron, and therefore we refer to the first neuron as the presynaptic neuron and the second neuron as the postsynaptic neuron. Another name for this physical location is a ganglion. The ganglion is the location of the synapse between the first neuron and the second neuron. Since the cell body of the first neuron is located upstream of the ganglion, we also refer to the first neuron as preganglionic and to the postsynaptic neuron, or the second neuron, as postganglionic. Also remember that the cell body of the first neuron is always located in the central nervous system, either in the spinal cord or the brain itself, and the cell body of the second neuron is located outside of the central nervous system. The cell body of the second neuron will naturally be found inside one of the many autonomic ganglia. There are some exceptions, but in general, when we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, the first neuron, or the preganglionic or presynaptic neuron, will have a very long axon, and when it synapses onto the ganglion, this ganglion here is typically located very close to the target tissue, often even in the wall of the target organ. For example, in the heart, the parasympathetic ganglion, in other words, where all of the cell bodies of the postsynaptic neurons are located actually in the wall of the heart. The typical setup of the sympathetic nervous system is for the synapse between neuron number 1 and neuron number 2 to be located in a ganglion that is much closer to the central nervous system, meaning that the axon of neuron number 1 will be relatively short compared to the axon of the second neuron. So in the top diagram here, you see a cartoon of a chain of two neurons in the parasympathetic nervous system. This first neuron has its cell body within the central nervous system, and circled in red here is a parasympathetic ganglion, which has the cell bodies of the second neuron right here, and also the synapse between the first and the second neuron, right here. So one landmark we can always rely on is that the cell body of the first neuron is going to be located inside the central nervous system. And since the parasympathetic preganglionic axon are typically long, that means that the parasympathetic ganglia are going to be located further away from the central nervous system. For example, in the walls of the target tissues, for example, in the walls of the gut, or in the walls of the heart. So for this reason, the parasympathetic ganglia are sometimes called intramural ganglia. And intramural means within the wall. Mural, like a painting on a wall, has the meaning wall, and so these intramural ganglia are located in the walls of the target organs, which makes sense because we know that the parasympathetic ganglia are located far away from their central nervous system. Now I've drawn a cartoon of a typical sympathetic pair of neurons. We know that the cell body of the first neuron is going to be located inside of the central nervous system, and we know that the cell body of the second neuron is going to be located outside of the central nervous system. But since the axon of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons are typically short, the ganglion will be located closer to the central nervous system. So in general, the parasympathetic or intramural ganglia are located far away from the central nervous system, whereas in the sympathetic system, the ganglia are located closer to the central nervous system. Now, this sympathetic ganglion here is always going to be located in one of two places. The first place where we can find sympathetic ganglia is called the sympathetic chain, which is a column of many, many paired ganglia, meaning on both sides of the body, and these contain the synapses between the pre- and post-ganglionic sympathetic neurons. So this ganglion here could either be located in the sympathetic chain in what we call a sympathetic chain ganglion, or it could be located in a special set of other sympathetic ganglia called pre-vertebral ganglia. So let's quickly review the location of the ganglia in the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic ganglia are usually located very close to the target organ, often actually within the wall of the organ, which is why we sometimes call them intramural ganglia. On the other hand, the sympathetic ganglia, remember a ganglion is the location of the synapse between the pre- and post-ganglionic neurons, and in the sympathetic system, these synapses, as well as the cell bodies of the post-ganglionic neurons, are either located in the sympathetic chain ganglion or in special ganglia called pre-vertebral ganglia. Now, the terminology for the ganglia can be a little bit confusing because the sympathetic chain ganglia can also be called paravertebral ganglia. Now, this term actually makes a lot of sense because para means alongside, like a paralegal is someone who works alongside of a lawyer. Now, these paravertebral or sympathetic chain ganglia are located alongside, flanking, lateral to the spinal column or the vertebral column. And when you call them the paravertebral ganglia, you're reminding yourself that they're located alongside, adjacent or lateral to the vertebral column, and which also helps you to remember that they're paired. So at every level, all the way from the thoracic and cervical areas down into the sacral and the pelvic areas, the sympathetic chain ganglia are located in a paravertebral location. So again, the sympathetic chain ganglia are also called paravertebral ganglia because they're located to the sides of the vertebral column. However, the other set of sympathetic ganglia are called prevertebral ganglia. So what's the difference between a paravertebral ganglion and a prevertebral ganglion? Well, a paravertebral ganglion, as we know, is just another name for one of the sympathetic chain ganglia, whereas a prevertebral ganglion is one that is located in front of, directly in the midline, because pre means in front of or before. A prevertebral ganglion is located directly in front of the spinal column in the midline. So here's a really simple cartoon of the locations of the sympathetic ganglia. These green dots here represent, of course, the paravertebral ganglia. They're paired, so you have one on each side of the body, and they run up and down alongside of the vertebral column, and so these are the paravertebral sympathetic ganglia. Now, these ganglia here, which I've drawn in red, these are unpaired, and they are located directly in front of the spinal column in the midline. So it's not surprising that these are called the prevertebral ganglia. And since they're actually located directly in front of the aorta, they're also called the pre-aortic ganglia. So if I now asked you to tell me where are the ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system, you should be able to say very quickly, well, there's two options. Number one is in one of the paravertebral ganglion, and number two is the prevertebral or pre-aortic ganglia. And a synonym for paravertebral ganglia is sympathetic chain ganglia, and a synonym for prevertebral ganglia is pre-aortic ganglia. Let's now walk our way along a two-neuron path in the parasympathetic nervous system. We'll start with the cell body, shown here, of the preganglionic parasympathetic neuron, which is of course located within the central nervous system. So this green circle here represents the brain and the spinal cord. So the cell body of the preganglionic parasympathetic neuron is going to be located inside of the central nervous system, and it's going to send a relatively long axon to connect to the cell body of the postganglionic parasympathetic neuron, which is this red dot here. Now, this green circle here represents a parasympathetic ganglion because it contains the synapse between the preganglionic axon and the postganglionic neuron. Now, this X here is the target tissue, and what I've tried to represent is the close proximity between the parasympathetic ganglion here and the target tissue. So we could refer to this ganglion here as an intramural or within the wall ganglion. Now let's walk along a chain of the sympathetic nervous system, a two-neuron chain. Once again, we have the preganglionic cell bodies located inside of the central nervous system, and they're going to send their relatively short axons into a sympathetic ganglion, which is this green circle here. They're going to synapse onto a postganglionic sympathetic neuron located in the ganglia, and then that postganglionic sympathetic is going to send its axon towards the target tissue. Now, I drew two ganglions here, or two ganglia, for the sympathetic system because they're two distinct sets of ganglia in the sympathetic system. The paravertebral ganglia, which are also known as the sympathetic chain ganglia, and the prevertebral or pre-aortic ganglia, which are in the midline, unpaired, and they're located directly in front of the vertebral column.